when we look at the amount of combat casualties during the war on the American side, just against Japan, and this is dead and or missing, 111,000 plus, how many more combat soldiers would have died versus the amount of civilians who did not sign up to fight a war, who did not volunteer to be killed, who were in fact killed by those bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's a very big moral question, I think. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? That was a poem written by the African-American poet Langston Hughes, who was very much aware of the racial element of the choice to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and very disturbed by it. And in 1953, he wrote that it's going to be very difficult for some Americans to think that the easiest way to settle the problem of Asia is simply to drop an atom bomb on colored heads there. And this was a reaction to the Korean War at that time. That's what this picture is. And again, it was a concern of his, which in fact didn't come to pass. The Americans did not use the atomic bomb in Korea. They didn't use it in Vietnam or in Iraq or Afghanistan. So does that mean that the racism theory falls apart? Or does it mean that the deterrence theory falls apart? Because after all, these wars weren't deterred, even though the US had atomic weapons. So on the subject of deterrence, we have another gathering coming up in November, which I hope you and many of your friends will also join, the Festival for Survival. And that'll be an opportunity for us to discuss the issue of deterrence further. But today I want to concentrate on the occasion we're marking anyway, which is, of course, the commemoration of the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm just going to give a little bit of a content warning because some of the images I'm going to show you and some of the language that you'll see is disturbing and offensive. And I'm not trying to offend or disturb anybody here. They're used as a historical illustration of the point that I'm going to make. So first of all, why did the United States use atomic bombs on Japan? There are a number of theories, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in play, one of which was to test the bomb on someone, Germany having already surrendered. They wanted to try it out somewhere, to warn the Soviets, who were already emerging as a potential future threat, to show who was atomic boss, to end the war and to save American lives. And while I think that the first two are very plausible, if not absolutely spot on, the second two arguments have been hotly disputed and in some ways discredited. And here's why. So one of the alternative theories is that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not end the war. And the reason being that even after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, we've seen in subsequent documentation of the communications within Japan that the Japanese Minister of War and the heads of the Army and Navy voted to continue the fighting. And even after the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki, the vote was still split. And it was by all accounts the emperor who split that tie. Why were they so unfazed by this horror? Because they'd seen worse. These pictures are actually of the firebombing of Tokyo, which happened earlier in the year in March and was the single worst firestorm in recorded history and killed as many as 130,000 civilians, which is about the estimate at the time of the sort of immediate deaths from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So they were very much prepared to fight on. And of course, the other theory is that it was in fact the Soviet declaration of war that caused Japan to surrender. But this issue of saving American lives is also very relevant to the racism component of this. The person I'm quoting here who writes, "Killing civilians isn't morally equivalent to killing soldiers," is Ward Wilson, who is an authority on the internal communications about whether or what actually caused the end of the war. Was it really the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And more importantly, an authority on the myth of deterrence. So if you haven't read Ward, I recommend him. But when we look at the amount of combat casualties during the war on the American side, just against Japan, and this is dead and or missing, 111,000 plus, how many more combat soldiers would have died versus the amount of civilians who did not sign up to fight a war, who did not volunteer to be killed, who were in fact killed by those bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's a very big moral question, I think. And the number, as you know, has been very hard to sort of pin down, because although the instant number tends to be in the sort of 110,000, it's clear that many people died horrible, lingering deaths, or even, several decades later as a result of the harm that was done then by the dropping of the bombs. So we've never really established a final number. So why Japan? The other issue was the incredible campaign that was launched to dehumanize the Japanese, really after the dropping after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. This began to paint the Japanese as was described, bow-legged cockroaches. And this quote from US General Joseph Stilwell, was in Time magazine, which is an august, serious publication. And he said, quote, "The ordinary unreasoning Jap is ignorant. Perhaps he is human. Nothing indicates it." So you can see the buildup in the minds of the American public to make the Japanese look like vicious predators on their women or rats or cockroaches was already underway to make the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki eventually much more acceptable. But even before then, President Roosevelt in 1942 issued an executive order that mandated the removal of the Japanese American population in the western part of the United States into effectively concentration camps. And they were given 48 hours notice to pack up everything and go to these dusty, remote, harsh conditions. A lot of them were elderly people. 70,000 of the 112,000 people who were put in these camps were American citizens. So it was a huge shock to them and a disruption. And in fact, in that 48 hours, they had to make provision for their property and their possessions. If they didn't do so, when they returned, those possessions and those properties were no longer theirs. They were effectively stolen in much the same way that the property and possessions of Jews were stolen in Nazi Germany. And what's really so remarkable about this, I think, is that it was just the Japanese population in this country who were treated in this way. Prior to that, there was no internment in concentration camps of German Americans, Italian Americans, or Austrian Americans, all of whom are obviously white. It was just the Japanese who were treated this way. The other thing we still see, it frustrates me deeply in print and elsewhere, is that the atomic bomb was only used twice. And of course, that's not true. It was used twice in war times, but it was used more than 2,000 times since then. So this is just a chart from the Arms Control Association. So you can see the tally, 2,056 total tests. The underground tests, are misleading because, in fact, a lot of the radiation got out when it exploded underground into the atmosphere as well, and of course into the water table and the groundwater. So although it was maybe only used in war twice, it was used many other times. And of course, again, the choice of where the nuclear weapon countries, the big nuclear weapon countries, would use their atomic weapons was often very far away from their own capitals, on the lands of indigenous people of color. So the US, even before the infamous Nevada test site, began testing their atomic weapons in the Marshall Islands. And the biggest blast that they let off there was the famous Castle Bravo on March 1, 1954, the most powerful nuclear device ever detonated. This is sort of I'm not sure if there's actual footage or a kind of rendition of what it felt like, but you get a sense, of the enormity of this blast. And I've got to go back, sorry. Well, so where they let off that bomb was at Rongelap, and those people were evacuated. After the Bikini blast, the people of Rongelap were evacuated after Castle Bravo, but only 2 days after Castle Bravo. So they stayed on their island for 2 days under that fallout, and they were returned there by the US government 3 years later. And this is why. And this is a quote from Merrill Eisenberg, who is the director of the US Atomic Energy Agency's Health and Safety Laboratory. And he said, that island is by far the most contaminated place on Earth. And it will be very interesting to get a measure of human uptake when people live in a contaminated environment. So they were removed too late and returned too early, precisely to become human guinea pigs. This little boy in the picture actually died in his early teens. And this is another infamous quote from Eisenberg. He said, while it is true that these people do not live the way Westerners do, civilized people, it is nevertheless also true that these people are more like us than mice. So following on from some of the graphics that we saw about how the Japanese were portrayed, the Marshall Islanders, brown-skinned people far away, were also portrayed as not exactly human, but not exactly mice. And they were treated as guinea pigs. And in fact, when the people of Rongelap went back to their island, they began to experience the most horrendous health implications, that diseases and illnesses, and especially birth defects, that they had never experienced. I mean, these were people who lived, in harmony with nature, took from the sea what they needed, and so forth. This is a long testimony. I'll read just the middle. She says, the most common birth defects on Rongelap and nearby islands have been jellyfish babies. These are babies born with no bones in their bodies and with transparent skin. We can see their brains and hearts beating. The babies usually live for a day or two before they stop breathing. Many women die from abnormal pregnancies, and those who survive give birth to what looks like purple grapes, which we quickly hide away and bury. So this was a frequent experience of these women on Rongelap, and this was an experiment as far as the Americans were concerned, something to celebrate. You've probably all seen this famous photo before, but it never ceases to shock and disgust, I think. This is a celebration of Operation Crossroads, which was one of the names of the bombing sequence in the Marshall Islands. And here are the top military brass. And of course, no one fails to notice that the woman's hat also looks like a mushroom cloud. So it wasn't until 1985, decades later, that it was Greenpeace, actually, with Rainbow Warrior, who decided that the people of Rongelap needed to be permanently evacuated. And they came in and they took them off because there were, by then, top couple of generations of these birth defects, cancers, and other illnesses that this population had never experienced. But from other atolls, most particularly where the US decided to set up its missile defense system, they were evacuated to Ebi, also in the Marshall Islands, which is now known as the slum of the Pacific. So again, these were people who were taken away from their traditional harmonious lifestyles and shoved onto a small atoll in slum conditions with poverty, inadequate clean water, and of course, then you start to see the rise in alcoholism and other things that are typical of these situations. So that's what happened to the Marshallese. The British, of course, as I'm sure you know, conducted 45 atomic tests. 12 of them were on the Australian territory of Aboriginal people. This gentleman in the picture is somebody who was an eyewitness to those tests, recalling the experience. 9 were in Micronesia and the 9 islands, and 24 actually at the Nevada test site. A lot of Americans, I don't know that the British were allowed to use the Nevada test site for their atomic tests as well. And there were 31 so-called safety tests also at Maralinga. On Kiritimati, also known as Christmas Island, when the people were evacuated from there to allow for one of these atomic tests, again, they were treated with no dignity. And this is a testimony of a woman who was a child at the time, recalling that there was no space on this ship. We were treated like animals. The French began their testing in Africa, again on Africans in Algeria. That became politically impossible after a while. They moved to French Polynesia. Mururo Atoll is one of the famous sites. And years later now, using declassified documents, researchers have estimated that about 110,000 people in French Polynesia were affected by the radioactive fallout from the French atomic tests. And that number represented almost the entire population at the time. So everybody in French Polynesia was harmed by the French atomic tests. And then there is the Nevada test site, and that was active between 1951 and 1992. There are over 1,000 tests conducted there, 24 by the United Kingdom. And this land belongs to the Western Shoshone people. That's a Native American band of people who never ceded the land to be used in this way by the American government, and can now probably legitimately say, alongside Vietnam, that they are the most bombed nation on Earth. Interestingly enough, the Western Shoshone land in Nevada was also selected to be the host of our country's high-level radioactive waste from the commercial sector. That's been canceled for the time being, but again, just violating treaties and other rights of the Western Shoshone. And then, of course, there's Trinity, much in the news right now, thanks to the film Oppenheimer, which has given an enormous boost to this issue and a great opportunity to tell the other stories that aren't in the film. The Trinity test victims, though, in New Mexico, the state in which that took place, have never, until now actually, and it's not quite done yet, have never been considered downwind victims eligible for any kind of compensation. And this woman on the right is Tina Cordova, who, thanks to the Oppenheimer film, after years of work trying to get compensation and recognition for Trinity downwinders, had an article in the New York Times, was on the front page of the Washington Post, and has been on national radio programs talking about this. And just this week in the Senate, they passed an amendment to something called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which allows for the inclusion of the Trinity downwinders who've never been in it before. And that's largely due to the work of Tina and others. This is Paul Pino, who's a member of Tina's group, actually, and now is involved in another fight, because beyond the atomic tests, once we started our so-called civil nuclear sector, something has to happen to the waste. And I mentioned that the Yucca Mountain site here was canceled. So now the US government is looking for so-called interim sites, which are effectively parking lot sites. And where are they looking? They're looking in predominantly Native American and Hispanic communities in New Mexico and also Texas. So Paul is one of the people who's involved in protesting that. But it isn't just, of course, a story about race, because here are two atomic veterans. The gentleman on the left is a UK veteran, on the right an American, and they too have been fighting for many decades, as I'm sure you know, to get recognition and compensation for the exposures that they suffered, and were, as they all say pretty consistently when you see the testimony and the films that have been made about them, used as guinea pigs, every one of them. Have suffered consistent illnesses consistent with exposure to radiation. Some of them were exposed at the time of the test. They were present for the test. Some of them were sent in as young men to, quote unquote, clean up the mess. And none of them were adequately warned, protected, and have been largely disregarded, as far as, you know, being, the burden of proof has been on them to prove that their illnesses were a result of these tests rather than the other way around. The Nevada test site, bizarrely, was promoted in some way. You know, it was sort of this tourist attraction for Las Vegas. I mean, these pictures I just find, you know, mind-boggling, because in fact, of course, the plumes from the Nevada test site went all over the place. In fact, there's a new study out right now that's showing, you know, the true extent of the plumes from these. But they went to numerous states adjacent to Nevada, where, again, the communities, many of whom are white, were not warned of, when the tests were happening, they were not warned of the dangers, they were not protected, and they are riddled with cancers and other diseases in those communities. And many of them have spoken out. You might be familiar with some of those. But again, you know, you look at that postcard in the middle of the family unpacking their luggage at the motel with that giant mushroom cloud in the back, and you think that's nuts. And then you look at this photo, which is an actual photo on the right, of people at a Las Vegas hotel with this mushroom cloud in the distance, and you can see what a sort of cavalier attitude there was towards it. This is just another postcard, because I just think these are so incredible. You know, come to the Pioneer Club and see a mushroom cloud, as if it's some sort of benign firework. And then there's this famous statement from somebody at the Pentagon saying, "Please God, don't let us have killed John Wayne," which in fact is exactly what they did do. This is the famous incident of the film, The Conqueror, directed by Dick Powell, produced by Howard Hughes, and starring John Wayne and Susan Hayward. It was filmed on location 137 miles downwind of the Nevada test site. And out of the 222 people in the cast that they counted, 91 of them got cancer, and cast and crew, and 46 died, including Dick Powell, John Wayne, Susan Howard, Agnes Moorehead, and Pedro Armendariz. So all of the stars of this film. I don't know whether that picture of John Wayne lying on that sand is a sound studio or actually the sand out there in the desert where they filmed it. But at any rate, they were dosed by spending time out there. The people who weren't counted and not named and aren't mentioned are the hundreds of Native American extras who were also exposed and who also have suffered as a result of filming this. And the sad thing is that The Conqueror is known as one of the worst films of all time. So it wasn't even worth the sacrifice to make this film. But of course, before all of this could happen, before any of this atomic bombing could happen, we have to start with uranium and where does it come from? And uranium, of course, has to be mined. And again, the story repeats itself that the communities that were targeted for uranium mining were predominantly communities of color or indigenous communities far away from the recipients of the product that they were mining. And again, at the beginning, at least, in the US, where a lot of the mines were on Navajo land, and that gentleman on the right is a Navajo former uranium miner, they were not warned of the dangers. They were told they were doing their patriotic duty, because this was originally for uranium for the bomb. Later on, it evolved to be uranium for the nuclear power sector. They were told they were doing their patriotic duty, but they weren't given protection or breathing apparatus. They wore the clothes home from the mine that they mined in. Their wives washed it. They brought the radioactive dust into their communities and contaminated their families. And these mining companies who walked away afterwards blasted 4 million tons of uranium out of Navajo between 48 and 86. I mentioned the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act earlier. These people, by and large, were eligible as long as they were mining before 1971. That's been extended now, but originally only those dates. But it's a very slow, complicated process. It's all in English, which for some of the Navajo elders, they can't read English. So it's quite difficult to get it, but they have compensated some of these people. In Canada, again, most of the uranium mining was on First Nations land, in particular up in the very Northwestern Territories at Great Bear Lake. Port Radium was where it was shipped out of. And some of that uranium went into the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And incredibly, in 1988, so 53 years after that, a group of 10 Dene traveled to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to attend the annual peace ceremonies there and to apologize, to make amends, because they felt bad that the uranium that they had mined had been used to kill Japanese people, other people of color. And they were apologizing and making amends, even though the village that they come from is known as the Village of Widows because of the toll it took on the uranium mining workers there. But the indigenous Dene believe that healing requires circles to be closed in order for reconciliation. So they felt obligated to do this. Now, it should be noted that the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom and France have never apologized to the people of Japan or to the people of the Marshall Islands or French Polynesia for what they've inflicted on them with their so-called atomic tests and, of course, the droppings of the 2 bombs on Japan. Where else does uranium mining happen? Well, for the French, a lot of it happens in Niger. It's also in the news right now because it's undergoing a coup. And this is actually a picture of a typical uranium miner's dwelling. So you can see that the riches do not come to the people of Niger. And oftentimes their dwellings were used, they used things like, you can see metal there. They used scrap metal that they found on the ground, a lot of which was found to be radioactive. They fashioned that metal into spoons, stools, things in their household. The right-hand picture is not mountains, those are tailings piles. And this is the Sahara Desert, a windy place. Actually, you can see kind of the ripples in the sand in front of you, in front of the mountains. And these tailings have blown around in the wind and scattered everywhere. There's 20 million tons of radioactive mess left behind in Arlit alone. This is Arlit. That's the mine. It's now been abandoned by Areva, now known as Orano. They've closed it. But that's the town. And in Arlit, there is often no running water. The gentleman on the bottom left, where you can see all those canisters on the little hand trolley, that's collecting water. Some of them have no electricity. So this is still one of the poorest countries in the world, and yet it has this rich resource that's been plundered by colonial France and others. In Australia, uranium mining has gone on predominantly on Aboriginal lands. Ranger Mine, which is also now closed, is right adjacent to the Kakadu National Park, which is now protected. On the right is an Aboriginal elder who's been fighting for more than 50 years to stop a uranium mining project at Yeelirrie. There are also efforts to stop nuclear waste dumps in Australia on Aboriginal land. So again, the idea is that we're going somewhere remote where nobody lives, but of course, people do live there. And this story is obviously not restricted just to the nuclear sector. It's true, at least in the USA. It is true in every area you look at where there is a hazardous waste siting facility of any kind. You can pretty much figure out from the postal code where it is that it's going to be in a predominantly community of color or a low-income community. And this is just an example of these terrible hog farms in North Carolina, these pools of excrement. And, there's about 1 hog per person in this state. But, for example, 2.3 million pigs are actually concentrated in one predominantly Black county. So it's a discriminatory practice that pervades all big industrial sectors, and the nuclear one is not by any means exempt from it. So I began with a poem. I'm just ending with a bit of a lyric from a song from U2, but I thought I'd reverse it so that rather than saying we're one, but we're not the same, that we need to remind ourselves that, yeah, we're not the same, but we are one. We're one people. There's no such thing as races. We're all one race, the human race. We live on this planet together. And if we're going to solve our existential threats, whether it be nuclear war, nuclear power, climate change, we have to recognize the element of racism within it and eliminate that if we are going to succeed in our endeavors. And this last slide is just my coordinates. I'm with Beyond Nuclear. That's our website address, my personal email address if you want to get in touch with me. And also we have a news website called Beyond Nuclear International. That's the coordinate at the bottom, where we run sort of some longer stories, and some of the pictures that you saw in the presentation are also in some of the articles on that site. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your kind attention.